"What are you doing in my room?" I called out softly, though my voice betrayed surprise and confusion. Ethan jolted, as if struck by lightning. He spun around quickly, clutching something in his hand. His face turned crimson, and his eyes met mine with a look of sheer panic. I was just looking for something Dad left behind," he stammered, his voice faltering, desperately trying to justify his actions. I stepped further into the room. My eyes settled on the object in Ethan's hand, a deeply embarrassing personal item that I had hidden carefully at the bottom of my drawer. It was something I never thought anyone would find, and yet there it was, in the hands of my husband's stepson. I couldn't stop my mind from racing, picturing him discovering it, opening it, and realizing what it was. My name is Emma. I'm 35 years old, living in a serene suburban mansion with my husband, Mark. From the outside, my life seems perfect. A successful, loving husband, a luxurious home with a sprawling garden, and every comfort one could dream of. But even the most flawless exterior cannot conceal the emptiness I feel inside. A void I've never found a way to fill. I met Mark 5 years ago. He was a charming, worldly, and magnetic man. When he entered my life, everything suddenly seemed brighter. Mark's maturity, stability, and success made me feel protected and secure. When he proposed, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world, but gradually, after we moved into this mansion, the very blessings I once cherished began to reveal their shadows. Mark often travels for work. His job demands constant travel, sometimes for weeks or even months at a time. When we were newly married, I didn't think it would be an issue. I kept telling myself that he was doing this to provide a better life for us. But with each of his trips, the vast house felt more hollow, and I found myself alone, adrift in a silence too heavy to bear. In the evenings, I often sat by the window, gazing out at the tree-lined garden. The distant glow of streetlights cast dancing shadows on the ground. I wondered if anyone out there felt the same as I did, drowning in loneliness within the very life they had once dreamed of. Those flickering shadows seemed to mirror my inner turmoil, a sense of imbalance I couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just Mark and me in the house. Ethan, Mark's son from his previous marriage, also lived with us. Ethan is 25, a young man with striking looks, but perpetually sad eyes. He rarely spoke to me. In truth, I hadn't made much effort to bridge the gap either. From the beginning, an invisible wall stood between us, as if he refused to acknowledge my place in his father's life. Ethan spent most of his days in his room. I only ever heard the sound of his keyboard clicking or the faint noises of video games coming from behind his door. Occasionally, he went out to meet friends, but he never told me where he was going or what he was doing. I used to think that time would eventually change things between us. But as the days turned into months, the distance between us remained unaltered. Once I tried to strike up a conversation with Ethan during dinner. Mark was away on a business trip, and it was just the two of us at home. I asked him about his work, about his life, but his responses were short and dismissive. When I asked about his mother, a woman I knew had passed away when Ethan was young, his eyes briefly reflected pain. Then, without a word, he stood up, mumbled something about being full, and left the table. I was left sitting there, staring at the unfinished meal, feeling as though I had accidentally touched a wound he would never let anyone see. On the days Mark was away, Ethan felt more like a stranger than a family member. Sometimes I even forgot he was in the house. He always kept his distance, and I lacked the courage to break down the invisible wall between us. Yet there were nights when I walked down the hallway and saw the light seeping through the cracks of his door. I couldn't help but wonder, did he feel just as lonely as I did? I never dared to enter his room or ask what he was thinking or what he needed. Maybe I was scared, or maybe I just didn't know where to start. All I knew was that there was an intangible chasm between us, a vague discomfort I couldn't name. Every morning, I kept my routine of waking up early to prepare breakfast for the family, even when Mark wasn't home. I wanted Ethan to feel that, at the very least, I was trying to fulfill my role in this family. But Ethan rarely joined me at the table. He'd usually grab a cup of coffee, mutter a quick thanks, and disappear back into his room. I didn't blame him. How could I blame someone as young as Ethan when I didn't even know how to connect with him? Yet every time I watched his figure retreat behind his door, a vague sadness would wash over me. It wasn't sadness for myself, but for him, for a young man seemingly trapped in the fragments of his past, unable to piece them together. Those peaceful days, if I could even call them peaceful, passed by slowly but uncomfortably. I felt like a shadow in my own home, a woman with no purpose other than to wait. I waited for Mark to return, for Ethan to open up, for something to change, but all my waiting felt meaningless. Until one day, everything began to change. The false peace I'd been living in turned out to be a fragile facade, barely masking the chaos simmering beneath the surface. And when it finally erupted, I knew my life would never be the same. That evening, the house was enveloped in silence. The familiar sounds, the ticking of the clock, the wind brushing against the windows, seemed louder than ever. I was sitting in the living room, attempting to read a novel, but unable to focus. A sense of unease crept over me. Footsteps echoed faintly from upstairs, breaking the stillness. At first, I assumed it was just Ethan moving around in his room. But after a few moments, I realized these weren't normal footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. My heart started pounding faster. I set the book down on the table and quietly made my way up the stairs, trying not to make a sound. The door to my and Mark's bedroom was slightly ajar. The glow of the bedside lamp spilled out, illuminating Ethan's silhouette as he rifled through our closet. "Ethan, what are you doing in my room?" I called softly, though my voice was filled with surprise and confusion. Ethan jolted, as if he had been electrocuted. He spun around quickly, still clutching something in his hand. His face turned beet red, and his eyes met mine with a look of sheer panic. I was just looking for something Dad left behind," he stammered, his voice faltering as he tried to come up with an excuse for his actions. I took another step into the room. That's when my gaze landed on the object in Ethan's hand, a deeply embarrassing personal item that I had hidden away at the very bottom of the drawer. It was something I never imagined anyone would find, and now it was in the hands of my husband's stepson. My mind couldn't help but picture him discovering it, opening it, and realizing what it was. For a moment, it felt like my heart stopped. A wave of shame swept over me, making my face burn. I didn't know how to react, so I just stood there, staring at Ethan with a mix of confusion and mortification. Ethan seemed to sense my embarrassment. He looked at me, then at the item in his hand, and immediately dropped it as if it were something cursed. It hit the floor with a soft thud, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a blaring alarm. Without another word, Ethan turned and bolted out of the room. I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the spot, watching him disappear through the doorway. The object lay there on the floor, a glaring testament to the awkward moment we had just shared. I bent down, picked it up, and hastily shoved it back into the drawer. My hands were trembling, and the feeling of shame consumed me. I couldn't stop wondering what Ethan must think of me now, and that thought unnerved me more than anything else. That night, the house felt eerily quiet. I sat at the dining table, nursing a cup of hot tea, hoping it would calm the chaos in my mind. But every time I closed my eyes, Ethan's startled and awkward expression replayed in my head, accompanied by an overwhelming sense of humiliation. I wondered, did he think I was some kind of strange woman? Did he feel disgusted by me? And more importantly, how was I supposed to face Ethan tomorrow? The next morning, Ethan didn't show up for breakfast. I called out to him, but all I got was a curt reply from behind his closed door. "I'm not hungry." I sighed, knowing he was avoiding me, but I couldn't blame him. I didn't know how to face him either. Throughout the day, I felt an invisible barrier between us. Ethan would retreat into his room at the sound of my footsteps. The fleeting glances and awkwardness between us made the atmosphere unbearably tense. That evening, I decided I had to do something to break the tension. Standing in front of Ethan's door, I took a deep breath before knocking. "Ethan, can I talk to you for a moment?" There was a long silence from inside before I heard slow footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and Ethan stood there, his eyes still filled with awkwardness, but with a hint of relief, as if he'd been waiting for this. "I want to talk about yesterday," I began, my voice gentle but firm. "I'm not angry with you, but I need to understand why you did that." Ethan's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands fidgeting as though trying to mask his discomfort. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice so soft I had to strain to hear. I didn't know what else to do. I owe some money, and I thought..." My expression softened. Any hint of anger I might have felt quickly dissolved. Instead, I saw the helplessness and anguish in his eyes. "You could have talked to me," I said, my tone filled with concern. "I would have helped you. You don't have to do something like that." Ethan looked up at me, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You're not mad at me?" I smiled, trying to ease the tension. "I'm not mad, but I hope you understand that you can always come to me instead of trying to carry everything on your own." He nodded, his shoulders seeming to relax a little. After that conversation, I felt as if part of the weight had been lifted. Yet somewhere deep inside, a strange feeling lingered. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that from that moment on, the relationship between Ethan and me would never be the same again. In the days following the incident, the atmosphere in the house felt different. Every time I saw Ethan, my chest tightened with awkwardness and guilt. It seemed Ethan sensed the same discomfort. We avoided each other during breakfast, lunch, and even during accidental encounters in the house. Yet at times, when his eyes accidentally met mine, I could see a mix of embarrassment, regret, and perhaps a hint of inexplicable curiosity. Ethan began to change. He no longer spent an all day in his room, immersed in video games, or deliberately avoiding me. Instead, he became more proactive, helping with small chores like clearing the table, taking out the trash, or even folding laundry. At first, I thought it was his way of making amends for the embarrassing incident, but over time, I realized it was his way of trying to connect. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants in the garden, Ethan approached with a small basket in hand. "Do you want me to help with anything?" he asked, his voice low but sincere. I turned to look at him, surprised by the shift in his demeanor. "No need, Ethan," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. But Ethan didn't leave. He stood there, watching me with a gaze that seemed to search for an invitation. "I think I should help. With Dad away, everything must be harder for you." I didn't know how to respond. His words, though simple, tugged at my heart. Ethan wasn't the careless young man I had thought he was. He was just a boy, lost in his own family. Gradually, our brief exchanges became more frequent. We talked about Mark's work, the books I enjoyed reading, or sometimes just light-hearted, aimless chatter. In those moments, I began to see a different Ethan, a thoughtful, sensitive young man longing for connection. One evening, while Mark was away on a business trip, the house felt unusually empty. I prepared a simple dinner and sat in the living room, the soft yellow glow of the lamp casting a warm ambiance that couldn't quite dispel the loneliness. Ethan walked into the room, carrying a cup of tea. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing the cup on the table. I looked at him, a little surprised. "Thank you, Ethan, but you didn't have to do that." He sat down beside me, his eyes meeting mine directly, no longer avoiding me as before. "I wanted to. You're the only person in this house who actually notices me." His words made me freeze. "Mark cares about you too," I said, trying to reassure him. "It's just, your dad is really busy." Ethan shook his head, a faint, bitter smile on his lips. "You're just saying that to make me feel better, aren't you? But I know he doesn't really notice me. Ever since Mom passed, I've just been a burden in his life." I looked at him, feeling the depth of pain hidden in his gaze. Ethan wasn't a fully grown man yet. He was still a child, longing for his father's love. "You're not a burden," I said, my voice trembling. "You're an important part of this family." Ethan laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Family? Families don't ignore each other like this. Dad never has time for me, and you, he trailed off, his eyes meeting mine with a look that was impossibly complex. What about me? I asked, feeling my heartbeat quicken. You remind me of my mom, Ethan blurted out. But also different. You're caring, gentle, and I don't know. I didn't know how to respond. Each word from Ethan felt like a sharp blade, cutting through my thoughts and stirring emotions I hadn't dared to face. At some point, Ethan had moved closer. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and a strange sensation spread through me. Then suddenly, Ethan reached out and gently took my hand. I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling, but I can't keep this to myself. Before I could react, he hugged me. It was an unexpected, awkward embrace, but it carried an overwhelming intensity of emotion. I froze, my heart pounding. The warmth, the closeness, and the fear all surged through me at once. Ethan, you shouldn't do this, I said, trying to push him away. But his eyes, earnest and filled with pain, stopped me. I just want you to know, he said, his voice breaking, how much you mean to me. The hug loosened, but the tension in the air remained. I knew I had to say something, do something to keep things from escalating, but I couldn't. My emotions were too tangled, too chaotic to find an escape. Every time our eyes met, my heart trembled. I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me craved the attention and affection Ethan was offering. Even though I knew it was all wrong, I couldn't stop feeling the warmth he brought. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a wife, a stepmother, or an accessory in someone else's life, but as a woman. That night, after Ethan quietly left the room, I sat there, my hand pressed against my chest, feeling my heart still racing. I couldn't sleep. The image of his eyes, his voice, and the embrace lingered vividly in my mind. I knew I had to create some distance, but how? When my heart had already begun to waver. The feeling wasn't just empathy, it was something stronger, more dangerous, and as much as I tried to convince myself that I could control it, I felt myself drifting toward emotions I shouldn't have. The days following that fateful hug were more awkward than ever. Ethan and I both seemed to make an effort to avoid each other, but the house was too small for that to truly work. Every time we passed each other in the hallway, our eyes would accidentally meet, and the silence that followed weighed heavily. Ethan, who usually spent his time in his room, now seemed to find excuses to linger in the places I frequented. I couldn't focus on anything. Routine tasks like cooking, cleaning, or even reading became difficult. Whenever I sat at the dining table or stood in the kitchen, my mind would fill with thoughts of Ethan, his gaze, his voice, and that unforgettable hug. One afternoon, while I was trying to sort through a pile of clutter in the living room, Ethan walked in. Do you need help with anything? He asked softly, though I could sense the tension in his voice. I turned to look at him. His young face carried an uneasy mixture of worry and determination. No, thank you, Ethan, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. But he didn't leave. Ethan stood there, his eyes fixed on me as though he wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. After a moment of silence, Ethan finally spoke. I'm sorry about that day. I shouldn't have done it. I froze, unsure of how to respond. It's okay, Ethan, I said, trying to sound casual. We all have moments of confusion. Let's just forget about it. But you haven't forgotten, have you? He asked, his gaze sharp. His question startled me. He was right. I hadn't forgotten, but I couldn't admit that. Of course I have, I said, trying to mask the unease in my voice. Ethan said nothing more, but his eyes stayed fixed on me, as if he were trying to read every thought in my mind. That evening, as the house fell silent, I sat on the sofa, my heart a storm of conflicting emotions. I kept asking myself what I had done wrong and why things had become so complicated. Just then, Ethan walked into the room holding a cup of tea. He placed it on the table in front of me without saying a word, then sat down in the chair opposite me. Emma, he began, for the first time addressing me by name. I looked at him, surprised by the shift in his tone. Are you happy? His unexpected question hit me like a blow. Happy? I repeated, stalling for time. I mean, are you truly happy in this marriage? I stayed silent. For as long as I could remember, I had convinced myself that I had everything. A beautiful house, a successful husband, a stable life. But was that happiness? Why are you asking me this? I said, trying to deflect the conversation. Because I can feel that you're not truly happy, Ethan said, his voice gentle yet resolute. I'm not happy either, and I think we're both trying to hide it. I didn't know what to say. His words touched a place deep within me that I had never dared to confront. You don't understand, Ethan, I said, trying to stay composed. Don't I? He replied, his gaze unwavering. I understand more than you think. The room fell into silence. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. And then Ethan stood up and walked toward me. I know this is wrong, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I can't stop thinking about you. Ethan, stop, I said, my voice trembling. We can't. But before I could finish, Ethan knelt down in front of me, his eyes filled with sincerity and longing. I just need you to know, he said, his voice breaking. You're the only person in this house who truly cares about me, and He hesitated, as if battling with himself. And I can't stop loving you. Time seemed to freeze as Ethan's words hung in the quiet air of the living room. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. Ethan, you don't understand what you're saying, I said, my voice trembling. I do, he replied, his eyes glowing with an emotion I didn't dare to name. I understand more than you think. I shook my head, trying to stand up and put distance between us, but Ethan quickly grabbed my hand. It wasn't a forceful grip, but a desperate plea, a silent request. Don't go, he said, his voice filled with urgency. I don't expect you to feel the same. I just needed you to know the truth. I stood there, my heart racing wildly. Ethan didn't let go of my hand, his eyes locking onto mine as if trying to etch every unspoken word into my soul. Ethan, this is wrong, I said, my voice weak, as if offering a half-hearted excuse. Why is it wrong? He asked, his voice no longer trembling but steady and certain. Can you feel it? Have you ever thought about me? His question took my breath away. I didn't want to admit it, that ever since he walked into my room with that conflicted look in his eyes, I had begun to feel things I dared not name. Don't make this harder, I said, trying to pull my hand away from his. Ethan let go, but his gaze stayed fixed on me. Have you ever truly been happy? He asked, his voice low, like a whisper cutting through my chaotic thoughts. I didn't answer. How could I when I wasn't even sure of my own feelings? You deserve to be loved, Emma, he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Not just cared for out of duty or obligation, but loved, truly loved. I didn't know what to do. His words cut through the emptiness I had been hiding for so long. Let's stop this here, I said, trying to keep my tone calm. We can't hurt Mark. Ethan let out a soft laugh, one devoid of joy. I've never felt like Mark really cared about me, and I don't think you're truly happy with him either, he said. His words hit me like a blow. I couldn't deny that there were moments I felt the same way, but that didn't justify the emotions brewing between Ethan and me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Ethan's face, his eyes, his voice, they all played over and over in my mind like an endless loop. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that this was just a fleeting moment of weakness, that it would pass, but my heart wasn't listening to reason. The next morning, Ethan avoided me. I could sense the distance in his gaze, as though he was trying to erase everything that had happened. But I knew, better than anyone, that he was struggling just as much as I was. We lived under the same roof, but each time we passed each other, the gulf between us seemed to widen. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, where one wrong step would send everything crashing down. One afternoon, while I was watering the garden, Ethan suddenly stepped out onto the porch. He stood there, his eyes fixed on me, but he didn't come closer. Do you need help with anything? He asked, his voice gentle but tense. No, thank you, Ethan. I replied, knowing full well that helping with the garden wasn't what he truly wanted. He stood there for a long moment, as if waiting for me to say something more. But I didn't, and neither did he. When he finally turned and went back inside, I was left with an aching emptiness I couldn't describe. I realized then that no matter how much I tried to deny it, the emotions between Ethan and me had crossed a line. After that afternoon, I made every effort to keep my distance from Ethan. I told myself that everything would be fine, that as long as we both stayed calm, things would return to normal. But reality was never that simple. One evening, while Mark was away on another business trip, I sat alone in the living room. The soft, warm light of the lamp illuminated the book in my hands, but the words blurred past my eyes without meaning. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the silence, and moments later, Ethan appeared in the doorway. He looked at me, hesitation evident in his expression. "Can't sleep?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "No," he replied, stepping slowly into the room. "What about you? Why are you sitting here alone?" "I just wanted some quiet," I said, avoiding his gaze. Ethan sat down in the chair opposite me, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as a sign of his nervousness. "Emma," he said, my name rolling off his tongue, so naturally it startled me. "Yes?" he hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. "I'm sorry for making you uncomfortable," he finally said, his voice filled with sincerity. I looked into his eyes and saw a sadness I couldn't ignore. "It's okay," I said, though I didn't entirely believe my own words. "I don't know what to do," Ethan continued, "but I can't stop thinking about you." His words hit me like a wave, breaking down the barriers I had been struggling to maintain. "You shouldn't say things like that," I said, but my voice lacked firmness. "Haven't you felt it too?" he asked, his gaze piercing through me. I wanted to deny it, to say that everything was just a misunderstanding. But the truth was, every time Ethan looked at me like that, a part of me wanted to believe his feelings were genuine. "Ethan, I'm your stepmother," I said, my voice growing quieter. "You're not my mother," he replied, his tone resolute. "You're a woman I can't stop thinking about." His words left me speechless. I knew I should get up and leave the room, but I couldn't. The moment stretched on endlessly, and then Ethan stood, stepping closer to me. "Do you feel it too?" he asked, his voice soft as a whisper. I didn't answer, only looked at him as my heart pounded in my chest. Slowly, he reached out, not to touch me, but as if asking for permission. Before I could process what was happening, his hand lightly brushed against mine, the contact so tentative yet so searing that it burned through the last shreds of my rationality. Here's the translation of the next part of your text, aiming for a natural American English style and close adherence to the original meaning. "Ethan, don't," I said, but my voice seemed to dissolve into the air. "I'm sorry," he said, but didn't pull his hand away. "I can't stop loving you." Those words tore at my heart. I knew I had to end this immediately, but instead, I let him hold my hand. The touch wasn't long, but it was enough to break every boundary. Afterward, Ethan pulled his hand back, stepping back towards the door. "I won't make you uncomfortable anymore," he said, his voice full of regret. I didn't say anything, just watched his retreating figure, my heart in turmoil. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, acutely aware of every beat of my heart, every empty feeling when the living room door closed behind Ethan. I knew I had crossed a line, but I also knew that a part of me didn't want to go back. In the days following that incident, I tried to avoid Ethan as much as possible. I didn't want to let anything go further, didn't want to destroy what I had tried to preserve. But my heart didn't listen to reason. Ethan was different too. He no longer avoided my gaze as before, but he didn't try to get close either. He became more composed, more mature, and that made me even more tormented. One morning, when I was making coffee in the kitchen, Ethan walked in. He was wearing a gray t-shirt, his hair a little messy from just waking up. "Good morning," he said, his voice gentle but with a hint of hesitation. "Good morning," I replied, trying to remain calm. He stood in the corner of the kitchen, watching me make coffee. The air between us seemed to thicken, every small movement making me tense. "Emma," he called my name so naturally that it startled me. I turned back, looking directly into his eyes. In his eyes was something that prevented me from looking away, a sincerity, a hidden sadness. "Are you still angry with me?" he asked, his voice deep but full of emotion. "No," I replied, but then stopped abruptly. "But I don't know what to do." He didn't say anything more, just looked at me for a moment, then walked to the window. That evening, I sat on the sofa in the living room, trying to read a book, but unable to concentrate. The soft yellow light shone down, but it couldn't soothe the storm inside me. Ethan appeared in the doorway, holding a mug of hot tea. "I thought you might need this," he said, placing the mug on the table in front of me. I looked up, his eyes gentle and patient. "Thank you," I said, trying to smile, but the smile felt as lost as my own mood. He sat down on the opposite chair, saying nothing, just looking at me. "Why did you do that?" I asked, not sure what I was referring to. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window as if searching for an answer somewhere far away. "I don't know," he said after a long moment. "I just know that you're different. You make me feel seen, understood." I fell silent. Those words, both sincere and painful, seemed to touch the deepest loneliness within me. Ethan moved closer, his eyes as if probing, as if searching for a signal from me. "I don't want to make you upset," he said, his voice trembling, "but I can't stop." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, feeling my heart pounding. "Do you feel this too?" he asked, his voice soft but weighted with meaning. I didn't answer, but my eyes, the way I looked at him, must have said everything. Ethan leaned down, gently embracing me. I felt his warm arms, his breath softly on my shoulder. "Emma, I'm sorry," he said, but his arms didn't loosen. I didn't know what else to do but let myself be held in his embrace, an embrace that I both wanted to reject and yearned to hold on to. Those moments stretched on, as if suspended in time, and then I gently pushed him away, my eyes filled with helplessness. "We can't," I said, my voice almost a whisper. Ethan nodded, but I knew neither of us believed those words. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the house became heavy. I tried to keep my distance, avoiding Ethan as much as possible. But ironically, this very avoidance made me even more aware of his presence. Ethan was no longer the carefree boy, only interested in playing games and shirking responsibility as before. He changed, matured in a strange way. He started helping me with small things around the house, taking out the trash, fixing the broken chair in the kitchen, even cooking when I was tired. One afternoon, while I was carefully watering the plants in the garden, Ethan approached from behind. "Do you need any help?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. I shook my head slightly, but Ethan still bent down, taking the watering can from my hand. "I just want to help," he said, his gaze so gentle that it made me flustered. I looked at him, seeing a determination that couldn't be refused. I didn't know what to do but nod and let him. That evening, it rained heavily. The sound of rain on the roof mingled with the rustling of leaves in the yard, creating a tranquil but melancholic scene. I sat by the window, looking out at the misty rain, my heart filled with mixed emotions. Ethan walked in, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. He placed one on the table in front of me and sat down on the opposite chair. "I sense you're sad," he said, breaking the silence. I looked at him, his gaze not leaving mine, as if trying to read my thoughts. "Why do you pay so much attention to me?" I asked, my voice low and broken. Ethan took a deep breath. "Because I see that you're lonely," he said, his eyes shining brightly in the dim light. "You always try to make everything look perfect, but you're not really happy." His words were like a knife stabbing straight into my heart. How could he understand me so well, when I myself didn't dare face my own feelings? "I shouldn't feel this way," I replied, but my voice lacked any conviction. Ethan moved closer, his eyes filled with sympathy. "Emma, you don't have to endure this alone," he said, his voice warm and sincere. I couldn't stop myself from looking up at him. The way he called my name, without any distance, without any defensiveness, as if I were the most important thing in his world, gave me a strange comfort. Ethan gently took my hand. "I don't want you to feel lonely," he said, his eyes as if trying to convey all the emotions he couldn't put into words. I wanted to pull my hand back, but I couldn't. I felt the warmth from his hand, the gentleness in that light touch making me weaken. "Ethan, we can't," I tried to say, but the words caught in my throat. "Just for a moment, Emma," he whispered. "Just so you know that there's someone who's always here for you." Those words, both sweet and painful, seemed to break down all the barriers I had tried to build. Without knowing when, the distance between us gradually disappeared. Ethan leaned down, his eyes as if burning away all my reason. I couldn't resist, nor did I want to. His embrace was strong, but also full of respect, as if wanting to protect me from all harm. I felt his breath, the sincerity in every gesture. But as those moments passed, I suddenly pushed him away, my breath quickening and my eyes panicked. "No, Ethan, this is wrong," I said, my voice trembling. Ethan didn't say anything, just looked at me, his eyes filled with pain and helplessness. "I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. He stepped back, then left the room, leaving me alone with a series of unnameable emotions. Here's the translation of the provided text, aiming for accuracy and a natural American English style. That night, I couldn't close my eyes. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart heavy with what had happened. I knew I needed to stop this, needed to end it before it went too far. But I also knew that deep down, a part of me didn't want things to stop. That feeling, both frightening and alluring, continued to haunt me in the following days. In the days that followed, everything seemed to be shrouded in a stifling silence. I forced myself to keep my distance from Ethan, but every time I met his eyes, my heart would surge. I tried to reassure myself that what had happened was just a moment of weakness, that I could still control everything. But the more I tried to forget, the more I was drawn deeper into those forbidden memories. That night, the rain fell relentlessly, heavy drops pounding against the window as if trying to break through the thin glass. The wind whistled through the cracks in the doors, followed by resounding thunder, making the whole house seem to shake. I sat alone on the large bed, my eyes lost in the darkness outside. Mark wasn't home. As usual, he was away on business. The large house was now just me and Ethan, a strange quietude, but also filled with the chaotic sounds of nature. I had just put my book down and was about to turn off the light when a gentle knock sounded on the door. I looked up, feeling my heart skip a beat. "Ethan," I called softly, but without needing his reply, I knew it was him. His voice came from outside the door, low but loud enough to cut through the sound of the rain. "I can't sleep. The rain is too heavy." I froze for a few seconds, my hands tightening on the blanket. "I'm worried. You're afraid of thunderstorms," he continued, his voice tinged with a worry. My reason told me I should refuse, but my heart, a heart that always craved connection, made me speak with difficulty. "Come in." The door opened, and light from the hallway spilled in, illuminating Ethan's face. He stepped in, his eyes filled with embarrassment. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt and sweatpants, but the sight of him made me feel unexpectedly self-conscious. He sat on the edge of the bed, his face full of hesitation. "I've been thinking all night, thinking that you're here alone, and I was afraid you'd be sad or worried," he said, his voice faltering, as if trying to find the right words. I smiled slightly, a smile more forced than natural. "I'm fine. I'm used to these kinds of storms." Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with an unexpected concern. "You always try to appear strong," he whispered, his voice gentle but full of understanding. "But I know you need someone by your side too." I looked up, our eyes meeting. In the dim light of the bedside lamp, His eyes seemed to glow, filled with emotions I didn't dare confront. "Ethan, I'm really okay. You don't need to worry." I tried to reassure him, but even my own voice lacked conviction. "You're beautiful," he said suddenly, the statement making me freeze. "You shouldn't live like this, alone, lonely, and hiding your feelings." My heart pounded, each beat seeming to echo in the small room. I didn't know how to respond, only lowering my head, avoiding his gaze. But Ethan didn't stop. He moved closer, his hands gently touching mine. I instinctively pulled my hand back, but the feeling of his touch remained, making me flustered. I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, almost on a whisper, "but I can't hold back anymore." Before I could react, Ethan leaned down, his lips lightly touching mine. It was a brief but emotional kiss. I didn't know what to do, just sat there as if frozen. And then, as if realizing my awkwardness, Ethan stood up, his eyes filled with pain. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice choked. "I shouldn't have. I'm sorry." He turned and left the room before I could say anything. I sat there, stunned and confused. My hand lightly touched my lips, where just seconds ago he had left his mark. My heart raced. My reason tried to scream that this was wrong, but the lingering feeling from the kiss made me unable to deny that, in that brief moment, I had felt alive, loved. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Ethan kept appearing in my mind. Every look, every word, every emotion he had conveyed. I knew I shouldn't continue, but a part of me longed to see him, to hear the words I didn't dare admit I was waiting for. The rain continued to fall relentlessly, the wind whistling through the cracks in the doors, mingling with the rumbling sounds of thunder, like a chaotic soundtrack echoing through the house. I sat on the bed, my gaze lost in the space before me, my heart full of conflicting emotions. My mind was torn between reason and heart, between what was right and wrong, between duty and desire. Then, suddenly, a gentle knock sounded on the door. I startled, my heart beating faster. "Ethan?" I called softly, my voice trembling, unsure if I wanted to hear a reply. His voice responded from the other side of the door, low and soft, as if afraid that even a louder sound would be enough to shatter everything. "Could you talk to me for a little bit?" I hesitated, clutching the blanket as if searching for some support. But then some force within me compelled me to nod slightly and say, "Okay, come in." The door opened, and the dim light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating Ethan's face. He stepped in, his eyes bloodshot as if he hadn't slept all night. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his face full of confusion and unease. He ran a hand through his messy hair, then looked up at me. "I haven't been able to sleep all night," he began, his voice breaking in the quiet space. I know this isn't right, but I can't stop myself." I felt a pang in my heart, seeing the inner turmoil in his eyes. "Ethan," I said, but couldn't continue. "I'm sorry," he said, his eyes leaving mine as if afraid to face the disappointment in my gaze. "But I love you, Emma. I truly love you." Those words, which I had tried to deny so many times within myself, but when I heard them spoken, I felt as if my whole body froze. Ethan moved closer, and before I could react, he wrapped his arms around me. His embrace was not only strong, but also full of sincerity and determination. He held me as if I were his whole world, as if he were afraid that if he let go, I would disappear. "Ethan, we can't," I tried to say, but my voice was trembling and weak. "I can't stop," he whispered, his warm breath lightly on my ear. I felt his arms tighten around me as if wanting to protect me from all harm. His eyes looked at me intensely, but not without gentleness. And then he leaned down, his lips finding mine. It wasn't a hurried or hasty kiss, but a kiss full of emotion, as if he wanted to convey all his feelings through it. I no longer had the ability to resist, nor did I want to resist. I could feel his heartbeat, his rapid breaths mingling with my own. His whisper echoed in my ear, softly but urgently. "Emma, you're the only one who makes me feel like I exist." Those words seemed to break down the last barriers within me. I held him tightly, feeling the warmth from his body, a feeling I had missed for so long. "I don't know where this will lead," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "But I know, right now, I just want to protect you, want to be by your side." I didn't answer, just silently nestled closer to him. Our breaths mingled, every beat of our hearts echoing in the dark room, along with the sound of the rain outside. His lips moved on mine with a kind of urgency that sent shivers down my spine. His hands gripped my waist tightly, as if he were afraid to let go. We kissed. We pulled apart just enough to catch our breath, our foreheads resting against each other, our breathing rapid and uneven. I could feel his heart pounding. The raw, intense longing in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just a moment of weakness for him. It was something he had been fighting for a long time, but didn't want to accept. We both knew clearly that this was wrong, impossible. But in that moment, everything else faded away. There were only two lonely souls finding each other, leaning on each other in the storm of life. Ethan's arms tightened around me, his whispers echoing in my ear, each word as if etched into my mind. "I don't want to lose you," he said. "I can't." "You won't lose me," I replied, my voice breaking. We sat there, entwined in the darkness, in the sound of rain pattering on the roof, the echoing thunder. That night, I knew that I had crossed a boundary from which there was no turning back. But at the same time, I also knew that, for the first time in years, I felt truly alive with my emotions. That fateful night, though full of guilt, was also, for me, the night I found a part of myself, a part that I had buried for too long. Half a month later, another night of heavy rain arrived, with thunder tearing across the sky as if warning of something. Outside, raindrops pounded the roof in irregular rhythms, and the wind whistled through the window frames like whispered curses. In my bedroom, Ethan and I lay on the bed that Mark and I shared as husband and wife. I nestled close to Ethan, feeling the warmth from his chest. The feeling of safety and longing made me forget everything, even the thunder and rain outside. Ethan gently stroked my hair. "Emma, do you regret it?" he whispered, his voice deep but tinged with worry. I looked up at him, our eyes meeting in the dim light of the bedside lamp. "Regret?" I repeated the question, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Perhaps, but sometimes I just want to live for myself a little." He didn't reply, only leaned down and kissed my forehead. The feeling was too strong, too hard to break away from. I knew this was wrong, but I couldn't deny that Ethan made me feel loved, noticed. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. I tried to push the guilty thoughts out of my head, but they clung to me. I wondered what Mark would think if he knew the truth. The thought made me shrink inside, but immediately after, Ethan's arms tightened around me. The front door suddenly opened, making a jarring creak as it hit the old hinges. "Emma, Ethan, I'm home," I startled, my whole body freezing. It was Mark. Ethan sat bolt upright, his eyes wide with panic. "Damn it, he's home," Ethan whispered, his voice lost. "Quick, hide." I pushed him off the bed, trying to keep my voice from becoming a scream. Ethan hurriedly grabbed his shirt from the floor and rushed into the nearby bathroom. I pulled the blanket up to cover myself, my heart pounding as if it wanted to jump out of my chest. Mark walked into the bedroom, completely soaked from the rain. "Why is it so dark? What are you doing?" Mark asked, his voice low, his eyes scanning the room. I awkwardly pulled the blanket closer. "Oh, I was reading, then I got tired and fell asleep," I quickly replied, trying to appear natural. Mark stared at me, his gaze sharp as if trying to see through my lies. After changing out of his wet clothes, Mark returned to the room with a pensive look. "Where's Ethan?" he asked, his voice stern. "He's probably asleep by now," I replied, trying to distract him. "Asleep? That kid never goes to bed early," Mark frowned, suspicion clear in his eyes. He quickly walked out of the room, heading towards Ethan's room. I stood frozen, my mind blank. Ethan! I quickly followed, trying to find a way to stop Mark. "Honey, it's late. Let's talk to him tomorrow," I said, my voice trembling. But Mark didn't listen. He knocked on Ethan's door. "Ethan, get up. I need to talk to you." There was no answer. Mark pushed the door open and found the room empty. He turned to look at me, his eyes suspicious. Why isn't he here? Where would he go at this hour? I was speechless, not knowing what to say. He probably just went to the bathroom," I stammered. Mark turned and walked towards the bathroom. I knew there was no other way. I had to do something. "Honey," I quickly called out to him, trying to draw his attention back to me. "You coming home early without warning was such a surprise. Do you want something to eat? I'll go prepare something." Mark stopped, looking at me for a long moment. "All right, I'll go downstairs," he said. He turned and went downstairs, leaving me to breathe a sigh of relief. When Mark went to the kitchen, I quietly slipped back into my room where Ethan was hiding. "Ethan, come out. He's downstairs," I whispered through the door. He opened the door, his eyes full of worry. "What do I do now? If he finds out?" "It's okay. Just stay calm," I tried to reassure him, but my own voice wasn't much better. Ethan nodded, quickly straightening his clothes and going downstairs. Mark sat in the living room, his eyes no longer holding their usual warmth. "Ethan, I want to talk to you," he said, his voice deep. Ethan walked down the stairs, each step seeming heavy. I stood behind, trying to keep calm, but my heart was pounding. Mark sat on the sofa, his eyes intently on Ethan, a hint of coldness mixed with scrutiny. "Sit down here, Ethan," Mark gestured to the chair opposite him. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the atmosphere in the room heavy. Ethan obediently sat down, but his hands wouldn't stop fidgeting, as if trying to restrain his anxiety. "What did you do today?" Mark asked, his voice even but carrying a strange weight. I stayed home, just played games," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice normal, but his eyes didn't dare meet Mark's directly. "Really? Then why was your room empty when I went up there?" Mark narrowed his eyes, his gaze sharp as a knife. I stood behind, feeling as if the ground beneath my feet was about to collapse. I didn't dare interrupt the conversation, only silently praying that Ethan wouldn't say anything incriminating. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. I just went downstairs to get a drink of water. I forgot to close my door." Mark nodded, but his eyes didn't leave Ethan. "Then why didn't you answer when I called you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, as if searching for a plausible explanation. "I guess I had my headphones on. You know, I usually don't pay attention." The answer seemed reasonable, but it wasn't enough to quell Mark's suspicion. He turned to me, his gaze meeting mine, as if looking for another explanation. "Emma, where did you see Ethan when I came home?" Mark asked, his voice low but laced with suspicion. I stiffened, trying to appear natural. "Oh, I didn't really notice. He was probably in the bathroom, I think." Mark looked at both of us, as if trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle he couldn't solve. After a few seconds of silence, Mark stood up and walked closer to Ethan. He placed his hand on his shoulder, his expression serious. "Ethan, I think you need to change. It's time for you to be independent. You're 25 years old. You can't live with your family forever." Ethan lowered his head, not saying anything. I could see his shoulders slightly trembling, as if wanting to protest but not daring to. "Next week, I found you a job at a friend's company. You'll move into a house nearby. I've arranged everything. This is a good opportunity for you to start a new life," Mark said, his voice brooking no argument. Ethan looked up, his eyes full of surprise. "Dad, are you kicking me out?" "It's not kicking you out," Mark replied, his voice still calm. "This is for your future. You need to learn how to be responsible and independent. I won't be here forever to take care of you." I felt a pang of pain in my heart. I knew Mark wasn't wrong, but I also didn't want to be separated from Ethan. This separation, even if necessary, still made my heart ache. In the days that followed, Ethan began spending more time in his room, rarely leaving unless he had a valid reason. I knew he was trying to avoid Mark, but I also realized that it only increased Mark's suspicion. My heart felt like a tangled mess. Mark's probing glances, his seemingly innocuous questions, all felt like needles piercing the fragile peace between Ethan and me. When Mark wasn't home, Ethan and I still couldn't resist each other. One afternoon, when Mark had just left to meet with a business partner, Ethan walked into the kitchen where I was washing my hands. "Ethan, why aren't you upstairs?" I asked, trying to keep my tone normal. "I wanted to talk to you," he replied, but his eyes couldn't hide his embarrassment. Ethan moved closer, and before I could react, he hugged me from behind. His breath was warm, his trembling fingers tightening around me. "We shouldn't," I blurted out, but my voice was choked and weak. "Emma, I know this is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. I turned around, trying to push him away, but his eyes held a pain that I couldn't ignore. I knew that we were both walking down a path of no return, but my heart wouldn't listen to reason. Just then, I heard Mark's car in the driveway. Ethan startled and let go of me, and we both hurriedly straightened ourselves. "Quick, go to your room," I whispered, gently pushing him towards the stairs. Ethan quickly ran upstairs, and I felt like I had just escaped a fire, but the embers still smoldered within me. Another time, when Mark was home, Ethan and I were too reckless. Ethan used the excuse of going to the living room to get a glass of water, but in reality, he just wanted to find a way to see me. When he came closer, our eyes met, and I couldn't stop myself from smiling. But as soon as Ethan took my hand, Mark unexpectedly walked into the room. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" Mark asked, his eyes full of surprise. I was looking for the TV remote," Ethan stammered, trying to hide the anxiety in his voice. I quickly interjected. "Would you like some tea? I'll make some right away." I diverted Mark's attention, trying to ease the tense atmosphere. Mark just nodded, but his eyes still looked at Ethan with scrutiny. At that moment, I felt like my heart was about to stop. In the days leading up to Ethan's departure, the atmosphere in the house became even heavier. I could clearly feel the unease in his eyes every time he looked at me. One evening, when Mark was away on a business trip, Ethan knocked on my door. "Emma, I don't want to leave you," Ethan said, his voice choked. "I don't know what I'll do without you." I turned away, not daring to look into his eyes. "Ethan, we have to end this. This is the only way for both of us to continue living without hurting Mark." "But are you truly happy?" His question was like a knife stabbing into my heart. I didn't answer, just walked to the window, looking out at the dark night. Happiness doesn't always come from what we want, Ethan. Sometimes it's what we have to do. Ethan came closer, wrapped his arms around me, and we went to his room and clung to each other one last time. Without waiting any longer, we plunged into a passionate embrace, entwined in the blankets, feeling each other's breath, every intense sensation of love overflowing in our two souls. We were as one, giving each other love, burning kisses as if we had nothing left to lose. And that night was both wonderful and full of loss, because perhaps we could never continue like this again. My mind was in turmoil. Perhaps soon Ethan would forget me and start over with a younger, more beautiful girl, much more suitable for him than I was. I felt the pain and helplessness of both of us, and I knew that this was the last time I could allow myself to be weak. Not long after Ethan left, I discovered I was pregnant. The result was both joy and extreme anxiety. I knew that Mark would be very happy and he would never suspect anything, but I wasn't sure whose child it was. When Mark found out, he hugged me tightly, his eyes filled with happiness. "Emma, this is what I've always wanted," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. I smiled, but inside me was a storm. I knew that I had to protect this family, protect the child in my womb from any harm. Ethan, after hearing about my pregnancy, secretly contacted me. Emma, is it my child? He asked, his voice full of worry. I looked at the phone, feeling my heart break. No, Ethan, he's Mark's son, I replied, my voice firm. I had asked a doctor to forge a DNA test result to confirm that the child was Mark's. Ethan was silent for a long time. I understand. If that's what's best for you, I'll respect your decision. I placed my hand on my stomach where the baby was growing day by day. I knew that this was the only way to bury all the mistakes, to protect this family and the child I was about to give birth to. Deep down, I promised myself that I would live for Mark, for the family we had built. But this secret, I would carry with me until the end of my life as a reminder of the boundaries I had crossed and the price I had to pay for my mistakes.